In the autumn of 1997, in a car park in Los Angeles, a young man from Detroit lost a competition and then drove home. He was 24. He had almost no money. The night before the competition, he had been evicted from the place he was living, which is to say he had gone to Los Angeles to compete for a prize, partly because he no longer had anywhere to sleep. He came second. The prize for second was nothing that would fix any of that. He drove the long way back across the country to Detroit, to a life that was not working, with a small daughter he adored, and no clear way to provide for her, and by any reasonable measure that trip was the end of something rather than the beginning. He had tried. It hadn't worked. That's usually where these stories quietly stop, unrecorded, because most of them do stop there, and nobody makes a film about the drive home, except that somebody in that Los Angeles crowd had been holding a cassette recorder. And that tape, a recording of a performance by a man who had just lost, was about to pass through several pairs of hands and end up, some weeks later, on the desk of one of the most powerful producers in American music, who would put it into the stereo of his car, press play, and start making phone calls before it had finished. That's the story tonight. Not the controversy, not the feuds, not the tabloid decade. You can find all of that anywhere. Tonight is the quieter version, how a poor, bullied, constantly moving kid from the American Midwest, who failed the 9th grade 3 times and left school for good, became, for a stretch of years, the best-selling musician on the planet. And how close the whole thing came to simply not happening. If you're here to fall asleep, this is a good moment to settle in properly. Let the pillow take the full weight of your head. Let your shoulders come down from wherever they've been sitting all day, and let your hands rest, and let your jaw unclench. Nothing in the next hour needs anything from you at all. You can follow the story closely, or let it drift into the background, or fall asleep in the middle and never reach the end. All three are completely fine. That's exactly what this is for. Before we go on, one small thing, and then I won't interrupt again. If this voice helps you get to sleep tonight, leaving a like costs you nothing and helps other people who are lying awake right now find their way here. And if you'd like this to be here again tomorrow night, you can subscribe. That's all. Now let's not think about any of that again, and let's go back to the beginning, which is a long way from Los Angeles, and a long way from anything anyone would call success. Marshall Bruce Mathers III was born on the 17th of October, 1972, in St. Joseph, Missouri, which is a small city on the edge of the Great Plains, a long way from either coast and a long way from where hip-hop was being invented at that exact moment on the other side of the country. His parents were teenagers, more or less, and they were briefly in a band together. His father left when Marshall was around 18 months old and never came back, and this is one of the small, sad, defining facts of the whole story, never responded to any of the letters his son wrote him over the years. The boy tried to reach his father repeatedly, throughout his childhood. The letters came back marked return to sender, or simply vanished. There was no reply. Ever. So he was raised by his mother, alone, in a poverty that was not occasional but constant and in a state of near-permanent motion. This is the detail that shapes everything else. They moved, and moved, and moved. Between Missouri and Michigan, from one house to another, from one school to another, sometimes every few months. By the time he was 12, he had been the new kid so many times that being the new kid was simply what he was, the small, quiet, pale boy arriving in the middle of term, in the wrong clothes, not knowing anyone, having to start again. Let your breathing slow here. There's no urgency to any of this. Constant moving does something specific to a child. You don't get to build the slow, ordinary friendships that most people take for granted, the ones that form over years of being in the same place. You learn, instead, to arrive, to assess a room quickly, to work out where the danger is, and to protect yourself. And because he was small and quiet and always knew, he was bullied, genuinely, seriously bullied, to the point where at least one assault was bad enough to be remembered for the rest of his life. He spent a lot of his childhood afraid, and a lot of it alone, and he filled the aloneness in two ways that turn out to matter enormously later. The first was drawing. He loved to draw, and as a child he drew superheroes, detailed, careful drawings of impossibly strong figures who could not be hurt, which is not a difficult thing to understand in a boy who was small and frightened and moved from town to town. He thought for a while that he might become a comic book artist. There's a version of him in another life who did exactly that, quietly, and you never heard of him. The second thing he found was words. Specifically, he discovered, through a relative, on the radio, in the way these things reach a Midwestern kid in the 80s, hip-hop, rap. And something about it seized him completely, the way a single thing occasionally seizes a lonely child and becomes the whole world. Here was an art form made entirely of words, of rhythm and rhyme and the sheer sound of language, and it belonged to nobody's neighborhood in particular once it came out of the radio. He started at around 11, rhyming words together, battling other kids in the school lunchroom, filling notebooks. It gave shape to a life that otherwise had very little of it. Let yourself sink a little deeper now. None of this is a test. You don't have to hold on to any of it. There's a fact from the middle of his teenage years that tells you a great deal about the household he grew up in, and it's worth sitting with quietly. When Marshall was 15, his mother had another child, a boy, his younger half-brother Nathan, and as things at home became more and more difficult, it was Marshall, a teenager himself, who increasingly looked after him. In time, he would become his younger brother's legal guardian. That's a heavy thing to carry at that age, to be a child who is, in practice, parenting another child, while also failing at school, while also being poor, while also being bullied, while also nursing a private and slightly absurd-seeming dream of becoming a rapper. Because the school part was not going well at all. He failed the 9th grade, the third year of what an English speaker might call secondary school. Not once, but 3 times. Some of that was the constant moving. It is genuinely hard to learn anything when you change schools every few months. Some of it was that his attention was entirely, completely elsewhere. He was not interested in the curriculum. He was interested in words and rhythm, and the one thing he had found that made him feel like something other than the smallest kid in a new classroom. At 17, having sat in the same grade for the 3rd time, he left school for good. He was not going to finish. That door, the ordinary one, the one that leads to the ordinary safe life, was closed, partly by circumstance and partly by his own refusal to walk through it. What he had instead was Detroit. Breathe out slowly. Let the shoulders drop again if they've crept up. Detroit in the early 90s is worth picturing, because the city itself is almost a character in this story. It had been one of the great industrial capitals of the world, the place that built the American car, the engine of a certain kind of 20th century prosperity, and it was, by the time Marshall was coming of age in it, in a long and painful decline. Factories closing, population leaving, whole neighborhoods emptying out. It was a hard city, and a specifically musical one, the home of Motown, of a deep and serious tradition of black American music, and its hip-hop scene, when it developed, was correspondingly serious. Unforgiving, you had to be good. And the proving ground, the place where you found out whether you were good, was the battle. Let me describe what that actually was, because it's the crucible everything else comes out of, and it's a strangely compelling thing to picture as you drift. A battle is a contest of improvised insult, in rhyme, in front of a crowd. 2 people stand up. One goes, then the other, trading verses, and the verses are attacks on your opponent's appearance, their skill, their clothes, their life. Whatever you can find and turn into a rhyme fast enough, the crowd decides who won, by sound, by the roar in the room. There is no prize, usually. There is only whether you beat the person in front of you, in public, with words, in real time, with no chance to prepare and nowhere to hide, if you falter. It is one of the most exposing things a person can do. And for a young white rapper in a predominantly black art form, in a city that took the art form extremely seriously, the exposure was doubled. He walked into rooms where the entire crowd expected him to be a joke, and he knew it. And the only way to change their minds was to be so good, so fast, so genuinely startling with words, that being a joke stopped being available as an option. He turned the thing they'd use against him into his own first weapon. He would open by mocking himself, by saying the thing the crowd was already thinking about the pale kid at the microphone, before anyone else could say it. You cannot wound a man who has already wounded himself, out loud, more cleverly than you were going to. It's a brilliant psychological move, and it came, clearly, straight out of a childhood spent being the new kid. Get the blow in first, on yourself, and take its power away. There's footage from those years, from a legendary Detroit spot called the Hip Hop Shop, of a shaven-headed young man, not yet famous, not yet bleached blonde, standing in a crowd, spitting lines at an opponent. And what's striking about it, watching now, is how completely at home he is. This frightened, bullied, constantly displaced kid had found the one room in the world where all of that pain converted directly into fuel. Every insult he'd ever swallowed, every time he'd been the outsider, all of it came back out, shaped into rhyme, aimed. Let your body get heavier now. Let the mattress take all of it, out of the battle scene. Slowly, he began to build something. He was part of a rap crew, under various names, that put out low-budget, cassette-only recordings that almost nobody heard outside Detroit. He released a first proper album, in 1996, called Infinite. It was earnest, technically skillful, and it went nowhere. It sounded, people said at the time, a little too much like other rappers he admired. It didn't sell. It didn't break him out of the city. By the standards of the music industry, it was a failure. And he was, by then, in his mid-20s, with a child, working ordinary low-paid jobs to survive, having given his entire life to a thing that had so far returned almost nothing. This is the part of the story that matters most, I think. And it's the part that usually gets skipped past on the way to the fame. Because at this point, Infinite has flopped. The money isn't there. The daughter he loves more than anything needs providing for. And the ordinary world he walked out of at 17 is looking less like a prison and more like a safety he threw away. At this point, most people stop. And it would not have been weakness to stop. It would have been sensible. It would have been the responsible, adult, defensible thing to do, to put the notebooks in a drawer, get a steady job, and let the dream be the thing you did when you were young. He nearly did. He has spoken since about how close he came to giving it up entirely, and it was out of that low point, genuinely one of the lowest of his life, that the second self appeared, the alter ego, the voice that would change everything. Let your breathing lengthen. In and out, longer. There's no hurry to any of this. The character was called Slim Shady, and he arrived by Eminem's own account, almost fully formed in a moment while he was in the bathroom of all places. Slim Shady was not a nicer version of Marshall Mathers. He was a darker one. He was everything Marshall felt but couldn't say. All the rage, all the resentment, all the violent, absurd, offensive, funny, uncensored contents of a mind that had been swallowing insults and disappointments for 25 years. Where Infinite had been earnest and careful and had tried to be liked, Slim Shady did not care whether you liked him. That was the entire point of him. He said the unsayable thing, gleefully, and the release of it, the sheer freedom of a persona with no interest at all in being acceptable, was electric. He poured this new voice into a recording, made cheaply, called the Slim Shady EP, and it was different. It was funny and frightening, and technically astonishing and completely unlike the polite record that had failed. It was the sound of a man who had stopped trying to be admitted to the party, and had decided instead to say exactly what he thought of everyone at it. Which brings us back to Los Angeles, and the car park, and the competition he lost. Let yourself settle a little deeper. This is the turn the whole thing hinges on. The event was called the Rap Olympics, an underground battle competition that drew MCs from across the country to Los Angeles in 1997. He went. The backstory to his going is almost too on the nose to be true. He had, by several accounts, just been evicted, and arrived at this competition with the situation at home about as bad as it could be. He battled through the rounds. He was extraordinary, and in the final he lost, came second, to another rapper, and the disappointment of that given everything riding on it in his head, given how far he'd come and how little he had, was crushing. First place was the one that mattered. He got second. He got nothing. He went home to Detroit believing, reasonably, that he had failed again. But in the crowd that night were people from the record industry, an intern, a staffer. The accounts vary in the details, but agree on the shape, who had been genuinely stunned by what they'd seen. And a copy of his recording made its way, over the following weeks, up the chain, from hand to hand, until it reached a man named Jimmy Iovine, who ran a major record label, and who listened, and who thought immediately of the one person who most needed to hear it. That person was Dr. Dre. Let the room go soft around that name for a moment, because it matters. Dre was, by 1997, one of the most important figures in the history of hip-hop, a founding member of one of its most influential groups, a producer with an almost supernatural ear, a man who had already changed the sound of American music more than once. He was, at that moment, looking for something new, and the story of what happened when he pressed play has become one of the foundational legends of modern music, precisely because it is so simple. He put the tape on, and he heard in a fast-talking, furious, funny voice from Detroit something he described afterwards as simply real and different and undeniable. There's a detail that everyone who tells this story keeps. Because it's too good to lose, he reportedly began making phone calls before the tape had even finished. He didn't need to hear the rest. He knew. Now, and this is worth pausing on, in the dark, signing this particular artist was not the obvious commercial move. A white rapper in 1997, in an art form created by and largely belonging to Black America, carried an enormous risk of being seen as a novelty at best, an insult at worst. Plenty of people around Dre were skeptical. But Dre's entire philosophy, the thing that made him who he was, came down to a refusal to care about anything except whether the talent was real. And the talent was real. That was the whole calculation. Everything else, the appearance, the expectations, the risk, Dre simply set aside because the voice on the tape was better than the objections. Lemaitre played him a piece of music in the studio, and, more or less on the spot, spontaneously, Eminem rapped over it the words that the world would soon know. "Hi, my name is Slim Shady." You know, more or less what happened next. Breathe out. Let your hands go heavy. Let the pillow take all of it. The Slim Shady LP came out at the very beginning of 1999, and it did not build slowly. It detonated. Here was this voice, this cartoonish, horrifying, hilarious, technically dazzling voice, arriving fully formed into a culture that had never heard anything quite like it, and it was carried by a lightness, a childish glee running underneath even the darkest material, that made it impossible to ignore. The first single mixed genuine menace with genuine comedy, and it was everywhere. The album sold millions. He won a Grammy, the first of what would eventually become 15. In the space of a few months, he went from a man who had lost a competition and driven home broke to one of the most talked-about figures in American music. And here is where the story stops being simply a triumph and becomes something more complicated and more human, which is what makes it worth telling slowly rather than as a highlight reel. Because the success was total, and the success did not fix the things underneath. It rarely does. That's one of the quiet lessons buried in this whole life, and it's a strangely comforting one to sit with at this hour. The man got, quite literally, everything he had wanted. The fame, the money, the recognition, the vindication of every person who'd ever counted him out, and the wounds that had driven him there were all still exactly where they'd been. The absent father was still absent. The difficult relationship with his mother was still difficult, and now it was being conducted brutally, in public, in his lyrics, for millions of people, which cannot have made anything better. The turbulent relationship with the mother of his daughter continued, on and off, through marriages and divorces, in the full glare of a fame that makes everything harder. Let all of that soften now. There's nothing here you need to fix tonight. Let's stay with the daughter for a while, because she is, in a sense, the still point at the center of the whole loud story, and it's a gentle thing to think about. Her name is Haley, and she was born on Christmas Day, 1995, before the fame, in the hard years, when there was no money and no clear future. And whatever else was chaotic, contradictory, or troubling about the man's public life, the devotion to that child was the one constant everybody agreed was real. She appears throughout his music, from the very beginning, in ways tender and protective and sometimes almost unbearably raw. A great deal of the drive, the refusal to give up when giving up was the sensible thing, traces directly back to her. He has said, in effect, that he could fail himself, but he could not fail her. A man who grew up with a father who left, determined above everything not to be that. There's a whole life's motivation in that single refusal. And he raised others, too. His younger brother, whom he'd looked after as a teenager, a niece whom he took in and brought up as his own. Whatever the tabloids made of him, and they made a great deal, the private pattern was consistent, and it was this. He gathered up the children the adults around him had failed, and he took care of them. It is not the image most people carry of him. It is, by all accounts, the truer one. Let your breathing follow that. Slow and unhurried. We should talk about the words themselves, because underneath all the noise and the controversy, the actual reason he lasted, the reason he wasn't a novelty that burned out in 18 months, is that he was, purely, technically, one of the most skilled practitioners the art form has ever produced. Rap is, at bottom, an art of language under pressure, of fitting words to rhythm, of rhyme, of the physical music of speech. And he did things with it that had genuinely not been done before. He rhymed words that don't rhyme, bending the pronunciation just enough to force them together, so that a line that should have dead-ended would suddenly turn a corner you didn't see coming. He rhymed not just the ends of lines, but the middles, stacking internal rhymes so densely that a single verse could contain a dozen hidden chimes you only caught on the third listen. He could rap extraordinarily fast, but the speed was never the point. The point was that even at speed, every word was placed, deliberate, load-bearing. People who study this stuff, and there are people who study it as seriously as others study poetry, because it is a kind of poetry, will tell you that what he was doing with multisyllabic rhyme and internal structure genuinely expanded what the form was understood to be capable of. Rappers who came up afterwards, an entire generation of them, absorbed techniques he had normalized. Whatever you think of the content, the craft was real, and the craft is why he's still here. And the craft came directly out of the childhood. All those notebooks. All those years of a lonely kid whose only real companion was language, filling pages, working out rhymes, with nothing else to do and nowhere else to put himself. The thing that made him great was the thing he'd built in the years when nobody was watching and nothing was working. That's worth holding on to. The invisible, unrewarded practice of the failure years was the whole foundation. There was no shortcut. There was just a decade of a boy alone with words before anyone heard a single one of them. Let it settle. Let it drift. The second album, which came in 2000, was where he became not just successful but historic. It sold at a speed that had never been seen in the genre, became for a time one of the fastest-selling albums in American history, and crucially it was better, broader. It contained the manic comedy people expected, but alongside it something deeper and stranger and sadder. There's one song on it in particular that's worth mentioning, because it showed what he could do when he turned the technique towards something other than shock. It's a song written from the point of view of an obsessed fan, a man who writes letters to his idol, gets no reply, and slowly comes apart. It's told in the form of those letters, growing more desperate and more disturbed, until it reaches a terrible end. And what makes it extraordinary is the empathy in it, the way he inhabits this broken, frightening figure completely, and makes you understand him, even as you dread where it's going. It became one of the most acclaimed songs of its era, studied and admired far outside hip-hop. The word from its title even entered the general language, as a term for exactly the kind of obsessive it describes. Notice what that song is really about, though, underneath. It's about a person writing letter after letter to someone who never writes back. It's about the silence on the other end. You do not have to look very hard to see where a man might have learned, in his bones, exactly what that silence feels like. The most celebrated thing he ever wrote was, at its root, about being the boy whose letters to his father came back unanswered, only with the roles reversed, seen now from the other side of the fame he'd once been on the wrong end of. That's the thing about the whole body of work once you know the life. The pain didn't go away when the money came. It just got transmuted over and over into something people could listen to. The wound became the work. Let your body get heavier. There's nothing to resolve. Then, in 2002, came the film, and it closed the circle in a way almost too neat for fiction. It was called after a road that runs along the edge of Detroit, the boundary, in the city's geography and its imagination, between one kind of place and another, and it was, loosely, his own story, a young man in a hard city, working a dead-end job, trying to prove himself in the battle scene, fighting his way toward a single moment on a microphone in front of a crowd that expects him to fail. He played a version of himself. The film ends not with wealth or fame, but with something smaller and truer. A single battle won, a bit of self-respect earned, a man walking back to his ordinary shift having proved, mostly to himself, that he was real. The song he wrote for that film went on to win an Academy Award, the first time a hip-hop song ever had. Picture that for a moment. The bullied, constantly moving kid who failed the 9th grade 3 times, holding an Oscar. And the song itself is, fittingly, about exactly this, about the single chance, the one shot, the moment that either happens or doesn't and never comes again. It's a song about the car park in Los Angeles, in a sense, about the cassette tape, about all the moments where the whole thing could have quietly ended and instead, barely, didn't. Let all of that go soft now. And then, because this is a real life and not a film, it got dark again. Somewhere in the years of enormous fame, he developed a dependency on prescription painkillers, and it grew, quietly and then not quietly, into something that nearly killed him. This is one of the most common and least glamorous endings to a story like this, and it very nearly was the ending. There was a period where the work suffered, where he more or less disappeared, where the person who had climbed all the way up from nothing came within a genuine hair's breadth of losing all of it, and his life, to the pills. He has been open since about how bad it got, and about the unglamorous, slow, one-day-at-a-time work of getting out of it. There was no dramatic single turning point. Recovery almost never has one. There was just the grinding, ordinary, deeply unspectacular business of stopping and staying stopped and rebuilding. He counts his sobriety in years now, and speaks about it the way people who have genuinely been to the bottom tend to speak about it, without drama, with a kind of quiet respect for how close it was. The album he made about that period, a few years later, is titled with the word recovery, plainly, and it was among the most successful of his entire career, which is its own small piece of poetry. The comeback wasn't the fame. He already had the fame. The real comeback was staying alive. Breathe out slowly. Let the shoulders drop one more time. We should spend a little unhurried time on the strangeness of what he actually was, culturally, because it's easy to miss now that he's simply a fixture, and it was not simple at the time. He arrived as a genuine paradox. Here was an art form born out of the specific experience of Black America, created in the Bronx, carrying decades of history and meaning and struggle. And here was a poor white kid from the Midwest who loved it completely, who had given his life to it, and who was, undeniably, extraordinarily good at it. That combination made a lot of people, for a lot of different and often contradictory reasons, deeply uncomfortable. What kept it from being a disaster or a novelty act was a few things. One was simply the level of skill you cannot dismiss as a gimmick, someone who is, measurably, doing things with the form that almost nobody else can do. Another was that he never once pretended to be something he wasn't. He didn't affect a background he didn't have. His whole persona was built, from the very first record, around exactly who he actually was: poor, white, from Detroit, an outsider in the music he loved and completely aware of it. He made his own awkward position the subject, rather than hiding it. There's an honesty in that which people felt, even when they disagreed about everything else. And crucially, the people whose opinion mattered most in that world, Dre first among them, had vouched for him, on the only grounds that counted: the talent was real. That endorsement, from someone with that much authority and that much to lose, was a kind of shield. It said, "This is not a marketing exercise. This one is the real thing." Let that settle for a moment. Let it go quiet. It's worth saying, too, because it's part of an honest account, that a great deal of the early work was genuinely offensive, and was meant to be. The alter ego existed precisely to say things that could not otherwise be said. Violent things, cruel things, things aimed at groups of people who had every right to object, and who did object, loudly and often. This is not a story where all of that gets waved away. It was real, it caused real hurt, and the arguments about it were serious arguments held by serious people. The defense offered at the time, by him and by others, was that the character was a character, a vessel for the ugliest contents of a mind, rather than a straightforward endorsement of them, and that the horror and the comedy were doing something more complicated than simple provocation. Whether that defense fully holds is exactly the kind of question that this hour is not going to settle, and shouldn't try to. What's true is that both things coexisted, extraordinary artistry and genuine offense, in the same work, at the same time, and pretending either one away gives you a false picture. The culture argued about him ferociously for years, and the argument was not stupid, on either side. What's interesting from the distance of now is how that ferocity has faded into something calmer, the way it almost always does. The things that felt like the end of the world at the time became, over the years, simply part of the record, discussed more coolly, set in context. That's not the same as saying the objections were wrong. It's just the ordinary way culture metabolizes the things that once shocked it. The shock wears off, and what's left is whatever was actually good underneath, plus a more honest reckoning with whatever was actually harmful. Both survive. Neither cancels the other. Let your breathing lengthen again. There's nothing here to decide tonight. There's one more thread worth following gently, and it's about the mother, because it's the hardest part, and it deserves not to be skipped. The relationship between Marshall and his mother was, by every public account including his own, profoundly damaged, and for years he said so in the most public way imaginable, in his music, by name, in front of the whole world. There were lawsuits. There was a great deal of very raw, very specific, very painful material, aired at enormous volume, about a childhood he experienced as full of instability and hurt. And then, and this is the part worth sitting with, much later, with the distance of years and his own experience of being a parent and of getting sober, something softened. He made, eventually, a song that was in effect an apology to her. Not a retraction of the pain, exactly, but an acknowledgement that she had been a young woman, mostly alone, with very little, doing the best she could manage with what she had, and that the picture was more complicated than the furious young man had been able to see. It's one of the more quietly moving turns in the whole story. The boy who had spent his early fame indicting his mother in public, arriving, decades on, at something closer to understanding. That's a very adult thing, and a very hard one. To hold on to the truth of your own childhood pain while also, at last, seeing the person who caused it as a person, limited and struggling rather than a villain. Most people never quite manage it. That he got there at all, in public, is worth noting, because it's the opposite of the image of him as pure rage. Rage was the beginning. It was not, it turned out, the end. Let all of that soften and drift now. And the father, the one who left, the one whose letters came back, never did answer, in any way that mattered. He surfaced, as absent fathers of the famous sometimes do, once the son was rich and celebrated, with a version of reconciliation on offer. By then it was far too late, and the son had no interest, and who could blame him? Some silences go on too long to ever really be broken. The letters had been sent by a child who needed a reply, and no reply that arrived decades later to a grown and famous man could ever land in the same place. But watch what he did with that absence, because it's the whole point. He did not become it. The most reliable thing about his entire adult life was the ferocity of his devotion to his own children, the exact thing his own father had failed to give. That's what you do if you're lucky and determined enough. With a wound like that, you make very sure you are not the one who passes it on. You become deliberately the parent you needed and didn't have. It doesn't undo the original hurt. Nothing undoes it. But it stops it, at least, from traveling any further down the line, and that is a genuine victory, quiet and enormous at once. Rest a little deeper into that. There's nothing to conclude. Let's pull back now, in the quiet, and think about the shape of the whole thing. Because the shape is the reason the story lasts. It is structurally one of the oldest stories there is. A person begins with nothing, less than nothing really, no father, no money, no stability, no safety, not even a fixed place to be from. Every single advantage that a life can hand you, this one withheld, and out of that, through a single obsessive talent developed in years of invisible, unrewarded solitude, the person climbs all the way to the very top of their world. We love that story. Every culture has it. It's the story under most myths, most fairy tales, most of the films that make people cry in the good way. And we love it for a reason that has nothing to do with a specific person and everything to do with ourselves. It says that where you start does not have to be where you end. That the accident of your beginning is not a sentence. That a boy with returned letters and a failed grade and no father can, through sheer refusal to stop, becomes something nobody would have predicted. But the reason this particular version of the story is worth an hour, rather than a slogan, is that it refuses to be simple about the ending. Because he got everything, and it did not heal him, and he nearly died anyway, and the wounds went right on aching through all the wealth and all the acclaim. The rise was real. The rise was also not a cure. Both of those things are true, and holding them together is more honest and stranger and in the end more useful than either one alone. Let that sit there in the dark, without needing to resolve into a lesson. There's a smaller thing worth turning over too, a thing about persistence, because it's the most practical thread in the whole story. Consider how many exit points there were. He could have stopped after the constant moving broke his schooling. He could have stopped when he left school at 17 with nothing. He could have stopped when the first album failed and the money wasn't there and he had a daughter to feed. He could have stopped after Los Angeles, after coming second, after the long drive home believing he'd failed. Any one of those would have been a completely reasonable place to give up, and nobody watching would have blamed him, and the world would never have known the difference, because the world never knows about the people who stop. They just quietly rejoin the ordinary. At every one of those points, the sensible move was to quit. And the entire difference between the life we're describing and the thousands of parallel lives that ended in that car park in Los Angeles comes down to the fact that he didn't. Not out of some superhuman confidence, by all accounts, but often out of something closer to having nothing else. No fallback, no other self to be. He kept going partly because he couldn't imagine what else he would be if he stopped. There's no tidy instruction to draw from that. Persistence isn't always rewarded. For every story like this, there are countless people who persisted just as hard and were never heard because the cassette tape didn't get recorded, or didn't reach the right desk, or reached it on the wrong day. Luck was real here. The tape existing at all was luck. Someone passing it along was luck. Dre being in exactly the mood to hear it was luck. He supplied the decade of relentless work. The world supplied the one improbable break, and both were necessary, and neither alone would have been enough. That's the honest version. Not never give up and you'll succeed. That's a lie, and everybody past a certain age knows it's a lie. The truer, quieter thing is closer to this. The work is the part you control, and the break is the part you don't, and all you can really do is keep the work good enough that if the break ever comes, you're ready for it. He was ready. That's the part that was his. Let all of that loosen now. Let it drift. Let's go all the way back, one last time, to the boy with the notebooks. Because that's where the real story lives, underneath all the noise that came later. Before the fame, before the controversy, before the Grammys and the Oscar and the millions of records, before the alter ego and the feuds and the tabloid decade, before all of it, there is just a small, quiet, frightened kid, moving from town to town, always the new one, always the outsider, filling notebook after notebook, with rhymes that nobody asked for and nobody would read, because it was the one thing in a chaotic life that was entirely his and entirely under his control, and could not be taken away by a move or a bully or an absent father. Everything that came later grew out of that. The technical brilliance was those notebooks. The refusal to quit was that kid who had nothing else. The rage that powered the early work was every swallowed insult from every new classroom. The tenderness toward his own children was the exact negative image of the father who never wrote back. The whole enormous, contradictory, world-shaking career was, in a sense, just that lonely boy's private language, turned up loud enough for the entire planet to hear. And the letters. Always underneath, the letters that came back unanswered. A boy writing into silence, hoping for a reply that never came, and then spending a whole life making sure the world could not, would not, ignore the sound of his voice. There's something to rest on there, as the night settles in around you. Not a lesson exactly, just the image of it. A kid alone with words in the years when nothing was working, building, without knowing he was building it, the only thing that would ever save him. You don't need to remember any of it. Not the dates, not the names of the albums, not the story of the cassette tape, or the car park, or the road at the edge of Detroit. None of this is a test, and there's nothing waiting for you on the other side of it. Your breathing has already slowed without you asking it to. The weight of your body has already settled into whatever's holding it up. The small tensions in the jaw, in the hands, in the place behind the eyes, have already begun to let go on their own. Whatever didn't work out for you today is all right. Whatever letters you're waiting on can wait until morning. There's nothing to prove tonight, and no one keeping score and nowhere at all that you need to be. There's nothing left to follow now. Just the quiet and the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath, carrying you the rest of the way down. Just rest for the whole rest of the night.